So we all know the story of Pesach Sheni, how there was a small group of people who were excluded from the opportunity to bring the Korban Pesach and complained to Moshe Rabbeinu they didn't want to be left out. Lama Nigora, why should we be pushed aside? Why should we be degraded? The question is, surely they knew why. They said themselves, we're impure. Did they not know the halachas? In Heintek Seder, nachdem wir die Torah erzählt wegen der Pesach Shossi Soba Midbar in our parasha, after the Torah tells us about the Korban Pesach the Yidden made on the first anniversary of Yetzias Mitzrayim in the desert, B'shana Sheni Setzeis Eretz Mitzrayim, as the pasuk says, it was the second Pesach after leaving Egypt. State, the pasuk tells us, Vahi Anoshim Asher Hayu Tmeim LeNefesh Adam, there were people who were impure because they'd been exposed to a dead body. And they couldn't bring the Korban Pesach. So they come to Moshe Rabbeinu and they said, we are impure because of this exposure to a dead body. But why should we be excluded not to be able to bring the Eibish's Korban at the correct time? So we have to understand, what is the question that they're saying? Why should we be excluded? They, in their discussion with Moshe Rabbeinu, they highlighted, by way of introduction to their complaint, they said that they're impure because they had been contaminated by a dead body. Obviously, they brought that up because they knew that that's the reason they're not allowed to bring the Korban Pesach. As the pasuk tells us. The Torah already told us that a person who's impure gets sent outside of the camp. Not only can he not bring a korban, cannot even be in that environment. So what's the complaint? To say we're impure, why should we be excluded? Well, you just said why, because you're impure. Rashi explains, Lomani Gora means, Amalahem, Moshe Rabbeinu told these people, Ein kachem krevim betuma. You cannot bring a korban when you are in a state of impurity. So they said, okay, we have a workaround. Let kohanim who are tohirim sprinkle the blood of the korban on our behalf, and let the impure people eat the meat of that korban. Now immediately the Mefarshim say, what do you mean? Who would even have suggested that impure people should eat the meat of the korban? So the Mefarshim want to say there's a mess up in the Girsa over here. Zogim Mefarshim. As das, as a state in Rashi's suggestion that the meat should be eaten by impure people is a safer. That is a printing error. Because we know that an impure person may not eat the meat of a korban. On a staff Shteinvi and Sifri, therefore the Mefarshim suggests that the correct version should be like the origin of Rashi's commentary in the Sifri, the Mokim from the Pirush Rashi, that they'll have the korban brought on their behalf, the blood will be sprinkled on their behalf, and then people who are Torah will eat the meat. They won't eat the meat of the korban. On Zayin Masber, therefore the Mefarshim explain, so therefore the Mefarshim want to say that what Rashi is suggesting that the group said to Moshe is, very similar to what the Sifri says, that it appears the seventh day of their purification process would have been Erev Pesach. In other words, that means as soon as the sun goes down, they would be in a state of purity and they'd be allowed to eat the Korban Pesach, because then they'd be pure. And also given so the Mefarshim say that's actually what they were suggesting to Moshe. Why should we be excluded altogether? There's a way you can include us. How so? Let the Kohanim do the Zrikas Hadam, which is one of the most important parts of bringing a korban on our behalf, while we are still impure. Then, by the time it comes time to eat the Korban Pesach later that evening, we'll already be Torah and they'll be fine and we can participate. Because despite the fact that the day of bringing the korban, the 14th of Nisan, they would still be in a state of tumah, still, so they were arguing that they wanted to see, perhaps from an halachic perspective, if by the time it's time to eat the korban Pesach that evening, they would already be tahor, surely there's an allowance for somebody to bring the korban on their behalf, because the kohen brings the korban on your behalf anyway during the day, and then they'd be able to eat it. That's what the Mefarshim suggest. But their pirish is tzarchir and gadol. But if that's what Rashi is trying to say, we have some serious problems with that. First of all, Aleph. Rashi damot nit afilu nit beremez as chol shvi shalem liyoser Pesach. Yes, the Sifri talks about the possibility that the seventh day of the purification process was Erev Pesach. Rashi doesn't mention it. He doesn't even hint at it. It's unlikely then that that's what Rashi was thinking. Number two, base. Look at the words they used. They said, we are impure, and therefore our question is, why should we be rejected? There's nothing in their words that implies we're impure now, but will be pure then. In fact, to the contrary, if you read at a pshat level, what they're saying is, in spite of us being impure, why should we be rejected from eating the Korban Pesach? Not because we will by that stage be Torah. So it's a real stretch to suggest that that's actually what Rashi was thinking. So let's see another suggestion from other Meforshim. Under a learner, the Pshat and Divrei HaSifri, so it's others who look at what the Sifri is saying, that the meat will be eaten by pure people. What that means is that their suggestion was, you know that the way Korban Pesach works is you have to predetermine a group of people who are going to eat the Korban Pesach together. So these people were saying, let's include in our group people who are Tahor, and they'll eat the Korban Pesach. So we'll just be part of the mitzvah, but we won't be allowed to eat the Korban Pesach. They'll eat it on our behalf. That says, in other words, we'll be part of the group, so therefore when they sprinkle the blood of the korban, which is a key part of the korban, we'll be included in that. It's as if we brought the korban. That means, the sprinkling of the blood will also cover those who are impure. In that way they could say, we've actually brought the korban at the correct time, we fulfilled the mitzvah. Practically, we can't eat the meat. Okay, somebody else who's part of our consortium, they'll eat the meat. And in order to endorse that opinion, the Sifri actually quotes the example of a korban chatas, where there is the possibility of a korban chatas, where the blood is sprinkled on behalf of somebody who is still tamei, because they have to wait for the sun to go down. In certain cases of chatos, they're bringing the chatas when they're in a case of tumah, as we'll see in a moment, and then by the evening they're toher. Right? So here are the examples. Even though the people who are bringing these karbanos, yoledes, a woman after childbirth who has to bring a karban chatas, tzaira, or a person who has saras has to bring a karban chatas, at the time they're bringing the karban, they're still in a state of tumah. Nevertheless, we say that's fine. They are in a state of impurity. We still bring the karban on their behalf, and somebody else eats it. The kohanim eat the meat of the karban. So why not have the same thing with the Korban Pesach? We'll bring the Korban Pesach on their behalf, and other people who are part of their group will eat the Korban for them. So the Meforshim want to say, Rashi has the same intention. Because what does Rashi say? The meat of the korban will be eaten by other pure people who are linked to us because they're part of our group. As other people who are not in a state of impurity, not tahorim, but in a state of purity, but in essence of Pesach, they'll eat the korban Pesach on our behalf. We'll have fulfilled the mitzvah of bringing the korban because we're part of the group. We won't be able to eat it. That's fine. Somebody else could eat it. It's a beautiful explanation, but it's very difficult to match to what Rashi said. Why? Because we know that a korban Pesach is not like other korbanos. Most korbanos, the person does not eat from the korban. Korban Pesach, one of the key factors is that you eat from the korban. That's why you bring it. So you and your family should eat from the korban. That's why you have to have this predetermined group of people, because the Pasuk tells us that you work out the group based on who's going to be eating. In other words, eating is a key component. So what does it help to have somebody sprinkling the blood on our behalf? If you're going to be missing the main part of what it is to have a Korban Pesach, which is that you're supposed to eat from it. Not only that, because the whole way that a Korban Pesach works is that you have to be pre-assigned to a group which is then going to have a Korban Pesach between them, and that assignment has to happen even before you bring the Korban Pesach to be shechted. And it's completely logical to say, any person who cannot be included in the group because they're not in a position to eat the Korban Pesach, if at this point you're not in a position that you can eat the Korban Pesach, you can't be included in the Korban Pesach, because that whole predetermination is what makes the Korban Pesach. So you cannot now sprinkle the blood on behalf of somebody who cannot, in their current state, be included in the group. Meforshim explain. That's why, going back to the Sifri that said, well, look, if you could have a korban chatos where the person is tamei and you have the kohanim who are tahor are eating on their behalf, Moshe Rabbeinu did not accept that kal v'chomer. He said, I don't accept that. I'm going to have to hear what the Eibishter has to say about this. Why did he not accept it? Because in a korban chatas, the people who are going to eat the korban are in the first place kohanim, who are not affected by the tzaras or the tumas yuledes of the person bringing the korban. So niti ba'alim tameim, the people who are the owners of this korban, who have the problem of tumah, are never going to be eating the korban in the first place. It was never on the agenda. So therefore, when I feel about kochim kalim was do achilas be'olim, and even if it were the lesser type of kochim where a person does get to eat from, like a shlomim, a toida, etc., the fact of who's going to eat it has no bearing on sprinkling the blood. Here, in order for a korban Pesach to be a korban Pesach, you have to have a group. That means the group has to be people who are ready to eat a korban Pesach. How can you possibly include people who won't be able to eat the korban Pesach in their current state? Therefore, the circumstances of a korban chatas, Moshe Rabbeinu says, will not tell us how to behave in the context of the korban Pesach, because the whole point of the korban Pesach is the people who bring it have to eat it. There's no logic to say you can sprinkle the blood now on behalf of people who currently are not in a position to be allowed to eat the korban Pesach, regardless of what's going to happen later. And most importantly, Rashi does and took in remes afilu of kol hanal. Again, Rashi doesn't so much as hint at this concept of saying, well, what the intention was part of the group would eat the korban because they tahor. So it's clearly not what Rashi is thinking. Now, before we can unpack Rashi, we're going to pay close attention to some of the language and the references that Rashi makes. To get to understand this, we have to pay attention to some key factors of what Rashi says. Number one, Aleph. This is surprising. Rashi is matik blois diverta lomeni gora. As he is heading for this Rashi, he only includes those two words, lomeni gora. Why should we be excluded? When he's afrin moisef a gomer, he doesn't even say an etc. to allude to the fact that they bring in the korban, maybe somebody could bring it on their behalf. Now, when Rashi proposes that what they were saying is, let's sprinkle the blood by tahor people, surely at that point, is Rashi before divided to Geverta, surely at that point Rashi is explaining the next words, which are, Levilti hakriv as korban Hashem. Why can we not bring the korban? Well, now you're talking about Zrikas Hadam, that's part of bringing the korban. Rashi doesn't include that in the headline, that part of the pasuk, which it seems like he's addressing. He doesn't even allude to it with an etc. Number two, why is Rashi emphasizing that Moshe told them that ein kochin krevi betuma, you cannot bring a korban when you're tummy? Surely that is common knowledge that they, like any other Jewish person, knew an impure person cannot bring a korban. So Rashi should have skipped that part and gotten straight to their argument, which was, listen, we have a workaround that we think is going to work, sprinkle the blood on our behalf. So the Mephoshim want to suggest that Moshe already gave them that information earlier. At the time that Moshe told them, you cannot bring a korban Pesach, which is why they're now complaining. Why are we being excluded? So obviously they realize they're being excluded, which means Moshe must have told them at some point. And at that point, he said to them, that's because kachim cannot be brought by an impure person. Which made them then think maybe there's a way that we could work this out. And then they came back to Moshe Rabbeinu and said, how about we get somebody else to sprinkle the blood? That's how the Mefarshim suggest it works. Aber von Pashtas Hemshech L'Shein Rashi is mashma. But if you look at the flow of how Rashi's worded his commentary, it implies Asam Lehem Ein Kachim Chulei. He said to them, you cannot bring kachim if you're impure. Is Gekumen als Enfrei Laminigara. The way Rashi is saying it, he has the word Laminigara, and then Moshe is responding to Laminigara by saying you can't bring kachim if you're tamei. Not like the Mefarshim say that they were saying Laminigara because he had already told them you cannot bring karbanos when you're tamei. So the way Rashi's putting it is, they said Lama Nigara. Moshe says, answer number one, you know why Nigara? Because you're Tamei, and a person who's Tamei cannot participate in Kachim. Number two, they said, well, what about sprinkling the blood? And he had to respond to that. So it's neat move on. So the question then is, so then what is their question to say, why are we being rejected? If they haven't yet been told, it's because impure people cannot eat a korban. Even before they get to their workaround suggestion. And also, what's Moshe telling them that people don't already know? You cannot eat kachim if you're impure. So they're saying, why are we being rejected? Moshe says, because you're impure. Surely everybody knows that. Boys Bays from Vanet Nem Rashi Bipshutish Mikras Dois Given. Where does Rashi see in the simple understanding of the psukim that over here was Nita in Shaila, was not a single question, Lo many go to the Vilti Hakriv Goimer. The obvious one that is stated in the pasuk, why are we being rejected? Now, where does Rashi see in the pasuk that there's a whole interaction and debate going on between them and Moshe Rabbeinu? First, the general question, why are we being excluded from the Korban Pesach? Then, where does Rashi see in the pasuk that Moshe responded to them to say, well, that's because you're impure and a person is impure cannot bring a korban? Where does he see in the pasuk that they then responded with another question? Well, maybe there's a way to do this by sprinkling the blood. And lastly, Gimel, when they said that perhaps we could have somebody sprinkle the blood, why did they have to emphasize that the people who will sprinkle the blood will be Toher Kohanim? Let's assume that they believed that in their current state of being impure, they still had the right to bring a Korban Pesach. Not only sprinkling the blood. Everybody knows that even if you could bring a korban, you'd never sprinkle the blood on the mizbech. Only a kohen can do that. And if it's going to be a kohen doing that, the only kind of kohen who could do that is tahir. So what are they saying that we don't already know? What's Rashi emphasizing over here? That their suggestion was use kohanim who are pure. That's self-understood, that they're only kohanim who could perform it in the Mishkan. What's most surprising about this is the Sifri. The Sifri doesn't even use this language, and that's Rashi's source. Nosasana himself is beer from Rashi. This is information that Rashi has added. Where did he get this information from? It's really strange. Had they said, sprinkle the blood on our behalf, surely that's enough. Why does Rashi have to add that this requires pure kohanim? Why? So the explanation is this. As soon as you read this pasuk about the complaint that they had, why we're being excluded from bringing Korban Pesach at the right time, straight away you should have an obvious question. The question is, throughout all of the description about how you bring a Korban Pesach, it's always written as do the Korban Pesach. Look at the psukim, even in our parasha. They made the Pesach. So you should make it at the right time. The word is always make the Korban Pesach. What's the question here? So these impure individuals who are coming to say we're being left out and we don't like it, they change the language. And they don't say They don't say we are not able to make the Pesach, even though that is the normal language associated with the Korban Pesach. No, hakriv is Korban Hashem. They completely change things to say, why can we not bring the Eibishter's Korban? That illustrates as dosan invos is by the esh do nischadesh gevoren. That means something about the Korban Pesach has now shifted. Their perspective and understanding of what the Korban Pesach is no longer as they thought it was before. Asiyas Pesach, now it's Korban Pesach. This is new information. Up until this point, they only knew that you make a Pesach. Now there's suddenly new information as Korban Pesach is an inyan von Hikriv as Korban Hashem. Now, for the first time, they realize that Pesach has the status of a Korban, as we're about to explain in detail. But let's look first at a high level. What changed? That now suddenly made them realize this new information about the Korban Pesach. Rashi matik from Pesach. Rashi illustrates the Pesach tells us Lama Nigora. Why should we be excluded? And Rashi Unzakti explains Amalahem that Moshe Rabbeinu told them that a korban may not be brought by somebody who's impure. To which they said let's get kohanim who are pure to bring the korban to sprinkle the blood on our behalf, and pure people will eat the meat. The fact that Rashi quotes specifically the words why we excluded, without giving an etc., Rashi is clarifying for us as is given a shaila bifnei atzma. Their issue was, why should we be excluded? Not why should we be excluded because we're impure. Why should we be excluded? In other words, they said, why should we be excluded? Moshe says, because you cannot bring a korban when you're impure. When Moshe said that to them, as in kotshim krevim betuma, that the issue over here is that a korban may not be brought when you're impure, their eyes widened and they realized as Pesach von hakrov as kotshim korban Hashem. Suddenly the penny dropped. The Pesach is a korban, which they didn't realize before. So now that they knew that the Pesach is a korban, that gave them the thought, how about another option? That because we cannot bring the korban, then at least let somebody sprinkle the blood on our behalf and it will kind of satisfy our obligation and participation. Which explains why Rashi had to emphasize that korban would be brought by kohanim who are tahir. Why? The mitzvah Rashi wants to emphasize as this is the first time they realize that the Pesach is a korban, therefore it requires kohanim, and therefore those kohanim have to be tahirim. The only people who could sprinkle the blood of a korban is a kohen, who automatically is tahir. Mashenken freer, but prior to that, based in Tain and Lomani Gora, when they first presented their case, why are we being excluded? They did not believe that the Pesach is a korban. Which is why they didn't at that point imagine that you have to be Torah. The Kohen has to sprinkle the blood, has to be Torah. It's not a korban. Und der Pharao haben sie gehalten, sie mögen das bringen betuma, which is why they originally thought that in spite of their tumah, they could bring the korban Pesach. Now they have this new information, the Pesach is a true korban, and now they're trying to find a way around it. So why did they ever think that the Pesach was not a real korban? The Asbara in them, the explanation is this. Let's start with the history. At Pesach Mitzrayim can get it from korban. The very first time the Yidden brought a korban Pesach was still in Mitzrayim, and nobody believes that was truly a korban. Look at the simple understanding of the Pesukim. It was a very unique mitzvah that applied once off in Mitzrayim. What was the instruction? Shecht a sheep, roast it, eat it together with matzah murah. And that's it. The Rabbi is not given kinyan of tzivah from akravas korban Hashem. Nobody said anything that it's a korban with all the rules of a korban. And the fact that you had to take some of the blood and put it onto your doorpost and the lintel of your door, that is not the same as sprinkling the blood on the mizbech. The Torah tells us clearly why they had to do that, to mark the house, that when the Eibishter is going to kill the firstborns, he'll see the blood of and skip over your homes, and nobody will get harmed. Nothing to do with emulating a korban. It's no longer from very B'Shem korban. That's why there's no reference when the Pesach was brought in Mitzrayim. No reference to the word korban. No blois B'Shem zebach. It's called a zebach. That's the pasuk. The word zebach is not something which is specifically a korban to Hashem. We have precedent in the Torah about bringing a zebach which is not a korban. In fact, the word zebach actually applies to slaughtering something in order to eat it, as they were doing in Pesach Mitzrayim. They were slaughtering the lamb in order to eat it. There's no concept of a korban. There's no concept of a korban. There's no laws of a korban. And das is given the nefesh adam, which is why this group of impure people are so surprised now that they're being excluded from the very next Pesach. We're now in the second year, which means the first anniversary of Yetzias Mitzrayim. The only precedent of a Pesach is the one they did last year in Mitzrayim. Now when they're being told, make sure to make a Pesach at the correct time, commemorating the Exodus, according to all the laws that you were given about the Pesach, they assumed same rules as we had in Mitzrayim, which was, do as you please. As long as you slaughter it, roast it, and eat it with matzah murah at night, nobody said you have to be pure. But especially because Rashi already told us all the way back in Parashas Boy, it's the true application of the mitzvah of Korban Pesach is when they get to Eretz Yisrael. V'lo nischayvim b'midbar ela b'Pesach echad she'osu b'shana she'nis al pi hadibur. And for the duration of 40 years in the desert, they only brought one Pesach by specific divine instruction on the first anniversary of Yetzias Mitzrayim, which is the one we're talking about. So if the core of Pesach is in Eretz Yisrael, Leitzach zu sagen, dass der Pesach Midbar hat nicht gehabt im Geder von Pesach Deures. You could assume that the one-off Pesach they're bringing on the first anniversary of Yetzias Mitzrayim in the desert does not have the same rules as the Pesach that they're going to bring for the rest of history in Eretz Yisrael, because that version of the current Pesach depends on getting into Israel. No, so if it's not linked to the future of Korbanos Pesach, then Osis given a Pesach Mitzrayim. Logically, it belongs to a commemoration of the first Pesach, the in Mitzrayim. Badi welche haben gemacht the Pesach Mitzrayim. It's actually the same people who brought the Pesach in Mitzrayim are bringing this Pesach now. With that information, these people came forward with a complaint. That you have to explain that the way they perceived the instruction to make a Pesach on the first anniversary of Yetzias Mitzrayim meant Asiyas HaPesach, Punkt für Pesach Mitzrayim. They interpreted and understood that means you do exactly what you did a year ago. A year ago, nobody was bringing a korban on a Mizbeach. Nadrabah, to the contrary, every individual, including impure people, because there was no instruction to purify yourself. Each person slaughtered a sheep in his own home, by his own doorway. And where does he eat it? Not in a communal place, similar to the eating in Yerushalayim, but in his own home. The night of the 15th of Nisan, zusammen Punkt vs. Matzah Morish enim kochim klal, together with matzah and moror, and essentially the same way as you eat matzah and moror, which are certainly not korbanos and can be eaten by any person anywhere. Und der Rebbe, wenn Moshe hat nicht gelassen, sich zum Staat zu sein, als es Pesach. When Moshe Rabbeinu says, sorry, you may not participate in the Pesach offering, they had a big complaint. Why? Why not? What suddenly is excluding us? Und das hat Moshe mechadish given. So Rashi tells us, so Moshe had to tell them new information and kachin krevin betuma, that a korban may not be brought when a person is impure. And Pesach is nicht bloß azevach, no kachin, was very nikra v'gabe ha-mizbeach. The Pesach is not a regular it's a slaughtering of meat to eat. It's a korban, and it belongs on a mizbeach. Over meile, if it belongs on a mizbeach, is a shaila being in what stand for? Is kachin krevin betuma? Your question, la menigara. The answer is because now it's a korban. Last year it wasn't. Now it is. Has the rules of a korban, which excludes people who are impure. Now you can understand why they came back with a rejoinder to say, hey, hang on a second. Maybe there's a way to do this. Let somebody sprinkle the blood on our behalf. And we could eat or pure people can eat the meat. Now, we know that they're impure. So Rashi must have assumed that the Tahirim are going to eat the meat is not them, because there's nothing in the Pasuk to indicate that they will be Tahir by that point. Because the Pesach Mitzrayim did not include bringing the animal onto the Mizbech. No, the only mitzvah that there was to eat the Pesach offerings. So these people think, aha, so now there are two components to the Pesach. The impure individuals believed, now that we have a Mishkan, which we did not have last year in Mitzrayim. And therefore, there's a new layer to Pesach, that it's also a korban. This is a new independent element linked to the korban Pesach. Certainly not going to diminish from the Pesach offering. And in their mind, surely the fact that you're adding another value to this, that it is a korban which is brought on the Mizbech, surely that's not going to remove the fact that there's a value in eating the korban Pesach. They're two separate things. There's a korban element and there's an eating element. So in their minds, there's the original mitzvah to eat the korban Pesach. There's the new mitzvah to bring it as a korban. Why would the new mitzvah to bring it as a korban diminish the original mitzvah to eat the korban Pesach? So surely there's got to be a way that we could still eat, even if we can't bring. As in Pesach sein for zwei Bazunder Inyanim. So their argument is the Korban Pesach now contains two independent elements to it. The one is not reliant on the other. One aspect of the Korban Pesach is it's a korban that you bring on a mizbech. And why do you do it? To remember and give gratitude to the Eibusher that he saved us when he killed the firstborns. Then that's the new component of the Korban Pesach, but there's still the original component base. There's a mitzvah to eat the Korban Pesach on the 15th at night. It's not that you're eating a korban, it's that you're eating a Pesach. Now, just like you have to eat matzah, which is not a korban, and you have to eat maror, which is not a korban, because that's part of how you commemorate Pesach. You have to eat the meat of the korban Pesach, even if you couldn't bring it as a korban. And therefore, that was their argument. We understand that we cannot bring the korban as a korban at the correct time. This aspect of bringing the animal as a korban is a new and independent aspect of the korban Pesach. Therefore, let somebody else deal with that. Let somebody else represent us to bring the korban because we can't do it because they're tamei. But the eating the meat of the korban Pesach, which is independent in their minds, that should happen to people who are pure on our behalf. In other words, people from the Pesach. So they get it. Okay, now you've told me that the korban Pesach has the concept of a korban, we can't eat it. But can kachim because a person who's impure cannot eat kachim. Okay, fine. So we won't eat it. Fine. And that meat is going to have to be eaten by other people who are Torah. We're okay with that. But why should we lose out on the new concept that the Korban Pesach is? Tell us we can't eat it? We can't eat it. You told us fine. But we can't be part of the new mitzvah to bring a Korban Pesach. We don't have to be there in order for that to happen. Let the Kohanim sprinkle the blood on our behalf, and gesundheit, everything's great, like the Korban Chatos on behalf of the person who's impure. Let them be impure Rashi. Now, okay, so what does Moshe have to respond to them? He has to say, no, that's not how it works, and you cannot have somebody bring a korban for an individual who is not shaykh to be able to eat from it. The two are actually amalgamated into a single chiyuv of the Korban Pesach, and unfortunately you misunderstood this as two separate components. Now, when we're looking from this perspective, what's fascinating here is that if you go with this angle, then the girsa that everybody wanted to correct, as if there was a mistake in Rashi, that says that impure people could eat the meat of the Korban Pesach, even this has a logical explanation. The very fact that so many commentators on Rashi say this is inappropriate, it should have said Tohirim, not Tameim, is given a that means that obviously they all had access to a version that said that the meat should be eaten by Tameim, and that's why so many different people are saying it's not correct, it's not Tameim, it's Tohirim. Well, it means because that was obviously the version that was all over the place. As the Rebbe says, as we often say, how do you know what the correct version of a copy of Rashi or other commentators is? So you've got to work out, well, where would the mistake have arisen? Nobody deliberately changes the words in a book. Must have been a misunderstanding somewhere. Let's put it in our context. Let's just say that the original Rashi did say that the meat should be eaten by impure people, and then all the Meforshim jumped on the bandwagon and said change it. It meant it should be eaten by pure people. So you can understand why somebody would say, this doesn't sit right, let's change it to become Toher. But if the original version said Toher, where would it ever turned into Tamei? Who would ever have accidentally written that meat should be eaten by Tamei if the original version was that the meat should be eaten by Toher? Anybody could have gone back to the original source in the Sifri and said, well, that's not going to match. Und Beis Vika hefach dem Ding maferish mafursim lakol as a tomatonit essen can kochim, especially because everybody knows that a person who's impure cannot eat the meat of kochim. So therefore, it's unlikely that anybody would have said, "Ooh, tahorim is the wrong expression. Let's change it to tmeim." So somehow, the original version must have said tmeim, and the question is why. It's the beer was because remember, we're looking from the perspective of the people complaining that they've been excluded. From their perspective, eating the Korban Pesach is nitaged from achilas korban hamitzvah b'fnei atzma. They saw eating from the meat of the Korban Pesach not as a halacha of a korban, but a unique halacha of Pesach. Nit verbunden mit hakrovas a korban, nothing to do with bringing a korban. As the B'sar Pesach can gegessen werden afile betuma. So you know what? According to Pshat, without getting into all the halachic considerations, but according to Pshat, there's room to suggest that, you know what, you could eat it even if you're in a state of impurity, if it's not a mitzvah of a korban. It's a unique mitzvah of Pesach. Dos, was the Torah aset atom zu essen kochim, is dafke, wenn es es als achilas kochim. When does the Torah say that an impure person cannot eat a korban? If it is 100% eating a korban. The Torah is very clear that if a person eats from a slaughtering that is for Hashem's sake while impure, then X and Y happens to them. Whereas their perspective was eating the meat of the korban is not really, of the Pesach is not really eating a korban, but nor als a mitzvah b'fnei atzma, it's its own independent mitzvah. Was Torah hat angesagt, wenn sie es nicht given kochim, it's a mitzvah that was given to the Jewish people before the Korban Pesach was upgraded to be considered a korban. Therefore, there's even a logical reason to suggest, as in dem Fall, that they could have said, you know what, you sprinkle the blood on our behalf, and we, while we're tamei, could still eat from this korban. And that actually makes sense, because they're seeing it that the meat is not in the category of a korban, which is forbidden to impure people. Now, with that explanation, that even when they're in a state of impurity, they could eat the meat, there is a little bit of a problem. What's the problem? If they believed that they could actually get the mitzvah of eating the Pesach, why didn't they say that? Why was their language that we're being left out of bringing the korban? If they actually believed they could eat it, they should have said, why can't we eat the korban? In their words, they don't say anything about being excluded from eating the meat. As the Inyan in them, explanation of that is this. The minute they heard that the Pesach this year is not like the Pesach last year, which was a private affair, but this is now korban dedicated to Hashem, is das geworden bei the Iker ha'inyan from Pesach. Suddenly their whole attitude changed. Oh, you're telling me it's a korban? That's obviously the most valuable and important part of this process. These people suddenly changed their whole attitude. There's an opportunity to bring a korban to Hashem that is exponentially greater than being able to eat the meat. Even if it's other people who physically are going to bring the korban on our behalf. That's much more important, much more valuable than whether or not we personally can eat from the meat. Because the greatest pleasure for a Jewish person is if I could bring a korban that gives the Eibusher nachas. The Eibusher says, I'm pleased by the fact that I gave an instruction that was fulfilled. In other words, the minute initially they're saying, okay, let's split this up, we'll be able to at least participate and eat from the korban Pesach. Then they hear, no, it's a real korban, and if it's a real korban, you're impure. Then they say, well, we want to be part of a korban. That's much more important than being able to eat, because that will give the Eibusher nachas. And then they are disappointed to hear that they cannot. But it doesn't stop there. There's a lesson for us in our service of the Eibusher and a much deeper perspective of what's going on over here. Because what did the Eibusher respond? From their perspective, their avodah, their dedication to Hashem, the most important thing for them, how do I bring a korban? How do I do what the Eibusher wants? But look what the Eibusher responded when he gave them a Pesach Sheni. As he gave them an opportunity to be able to do the whole korban Pesach with all of its components. And there is the Ikad Gosh Pesach Hashem. The Eibusher did not word it in such a way that now you'll have the opportunity to bring me a korban. The language is all in the direction or the emphasis of you'll be able to make the Pesach and eat the Korban Pesach. Why? Because the ultimate goal of the Korban Pesach is not just to bring a Korban on Hashem's Mizbech, which is elevating something physical to a higher spiritual connection to the Eibishter. Hashem, to take the blood and fats of this animal and elevate them to the Eibishter's Korban. That's not the goal. The goal of Korban Pesach is to bring holiness down into a tangible way that a human being can eat and make it part of his system. Because that fulfills the Eibishter's objective for creation, which is that the world should become Hashem's home. And so therefore, yes, it's beautiful that they were so dedicated to do what's going to make the Eibishter happy. But you know what's going to make the Eibishter happy? When Kedusha can seep into the reality of a human being, of a Jewish person, when you can eat the Korban Pesach. Therefore, Pesach Sheni is not just about bringing a Korban, it's about being able to eat the Korban and bring the holiness into our lives.